Because I felt like I was very excitable in getting the students worked up, and then I was so proud of how it came out the second time, and my son was like, why are you whispering, Mom? I'm like, I'm not whispering, I tried to slow my voice down. And he's like, okay. And then my $2 like, no, it sounds great. And then I'm like, I don't know.
Voice in it. I
hate my voice.
Everybody
I decided I have to get over it.
I mean, there's a physiological reason behind that, because your hearing mechanism is physically connected to the mechanism that's making your voice. So your experience of your own voice, a good percentage of that is direct transmission through your bones.
Yeah. Okay.
That is not what anybody else hears, but it's what you hear all the time. So if you ever see singers, they'll sometimes do this, where you cup a hand like this, like put the finger, because what you're doing then is you're funneling more of the sound from your voice into your ear.
Putting those things in there when they sing, they always have their.
Well, that's actually makes it worse, because now you're getting almost all of your transmission directly from your voice. But if you want a better sense of what your voice actually sounds like, what this does is put more. You're not closing your ear; you're funneling sound from your mouth into your ear, so that you're.
Parabolic shape of the cupping of your hand.
Yeah.
Direct the sound.
So, but everybody hates their voice. I've never run into a single person who, when they hear their voice recorded, goes, I really love the sound of my voice.
I bet Nick Foreman loves the sound of it.
I always drop my voice. I use a vocal processor, and I drop it like 2 half steps, and just round the formants down a little bit too. Yeah, if I have to do like voiceover announcements for plays or things like that, I always give my voice.
Well, that's when I was like, I wish I hadn't done all the vocal work, and it took a while to get everything lined up, to work. So that's why I was like, had I done the audio one earlier, I would have probably done them that way, and then up.
It's 2 different classes, so I'm not really looking necessarily at like synchronizing.
No, it's not your fault at all. But I was like, oh, that's cool. So for my next one,
they should just turn it into one 6-credit course.
It really should.
And just like push it all together and have some of the content be done offline and other content done online.
Well, and I will tell you the other thing is though, with the video, you can drop in like an audio track. So like a lot of what I didn't like about the recording, I was like, oh, from now on, I could do. I couldn't get it to take an Audacity file. Oh, I wonder if you saved it as an MP3.
Yeah, you have.
It will take it. Yeah.
Yeah, you would have to export it as an MP3 for it to import into something. Yeah. So. All right. Well, let's get started. We'll see. Maybe Donnie is coming tomorrow night. I don't know, but we'll see. Or maybe the weather's bad with the rain. So So first of all, thank you for being flexible and shifting to tonight. Even though I got through the play last week, now there's one of our elementary schools has their talent show, which dress rehearses tomorrow and then has a performance Thursday night. So their dress rehearsal goes till about 6:30, and I was not able to get up here for tomorrow at that time. So, but tonight is mainly continuing on with sort of understanding what games are. We've got a good working definition of games from our last class meeting. The sort of core elements of it needs competing agents, it needs a set of rules, it needs those meaningful and ambiguous decisions, and an end game. So I think we've got a pretty good handle on all that. So tonight the main focus is on probably what is the most important tool in developing a game, which is the flow chart, because the flow chart will let you make sure that you've accounted for every possibility in your game. From an educational standpoint, the last thing you want to do, just like with a video, you don't want to put on a video and then have the vocals be so quiet that the students can't hear it. With a game, the equivalent is usually that you give the students a game, and then of course they discover the one combination of choices or decisions that then goes outside of the rules, and then they don't know what to do next, or they have to start over, or they get frustrated, or whatever. So as you start to think about the set of rules that is your game, the flow chart is actually going to be the main tool for helping you develop those rules, because you'll discover places where people can exit out of the game, and in that case, that's a place where you put a rule that accounts for that situation. And in the end, what you want to have is a completely closed system where there's no way to get outside of the system. So what we're going to do tonight is reverse engineer an existing game just to get an idea of what flowcharting a game looks like and the kinds of things you have to think about. And that's going to be the main activity for tonight, which is why I wanted to make sure everybody was together, because it is a on paper and moving things around and discussing and kind of activity. So that's sort of tonight. Obviously, I've already been talking about this, but the next couple of weeks, we have next week and then the week after is spring break for Central. Next week, I guess I should talk about this now. So next week on our original syllabi for both classes is an alpha testing week for two main projects, for the game projects in here and for the Moodles in the other class. And it was one of the couple of weeks in the course where the 5:30 class was going to be meeting on campus. Because what I want to do is give everybody a chance to pull their Moodles up on a screen and have somebody else sit down with them and see what they've done and have a conversation about the structure and suggestions. And they're not done, they're not supposed to be done, but at least get some of that external feedback from somebody. So rather than making people come both nights to campus, what I want to get a sense of as a proposal is to essentially mush the two classes together next week into Wednesday night, which will mean Wednesday night will probably be a little longer than normal, but I'm going to try to not go longer than, say, 3 hours. So we normally go 5 to 7-ish or 5 to 7:15, do like 5 to 8, and I do have a bit of an instructional piece with the 5:20 class. So, with the 5:30 class, the online instruction class. So that will take a little bit of time, but then it's mainly just about that alpha testing thing, which isn't going to take a full 2 hours. So I figured that way, and what we'll do is we'll start with 5:20, because that's the class that has 9 people in it. And then Yolanda and Donnie, who are not in the 5:30 class, can leave, and the rest of us will just stay and continue on with the other. So
it's the 11th. Just want to make sure.
That is, yes, the 11th,
Okay.
Wednesday the 11th.
I just want to make sure we have next week the 11th.
Yeah.
11th.
So it'll be just a conflating of the two classes into one night, so that people don't have to get up here 2 nights.
So it'll be Wednesday night and 5:30.
Yeah,
Wednesday night.
5:20 first, then 5:30, 5 o'clock, and plan on being done by 8. I mean, it's very likely we would actually not even necessarily go that late. And I'll obviously double check this with the people who are coming tomorrow night's class. But I'm hoping that everyone would much rather stay for an extra hour one night than to have to drive up here 2 nights in a row, myself included.
No, that's
So
hey, I'm
with you.
I'm with you. And Paul's home next week, so I'm good. The following week, I'm like, tell me it's the following week. But even if it was only till 8 o'clock, that'd be fine. But
yeah, and I think
my
even
husband travels like 4 times a year, and I'm like, of course it would be.
Yeah. Well, and I also, the people who are not here tonight are the ones who said they were available and actually more interested in staying later on a Wednesday night than to come on a Tuesday night. So I'm thinking that group of people already has kind of self-selected to be the group of people that doesn't mind staying later on a Wednesday.
Right.
So that'll be the plan next week. You'll be able to leave next week with feedback about both the game project and about your Moodles. And then you've got that full 2 weeks during the CCSU spring break to really just focus on getting a bunch of production done and so on. So that's why I want to get both of those feedback activities in before that spring break. So in terms of the Powtoons, you may have heard me say already, since this week is technically the due week for the Powtoons, I haven't officially looked at them yet unless somebody asked me to look at something. So I will assume, unless I hear from anybody, that by tomorrow night at midnight that they are done, and I will start taking a look through those and providing feedback on the rubric and so on for those projects, because those basically we can move on from that and move on to new things. All right, so I think that's, in terms of sort of where we are and what's coming up over the next couple of weeks, I think that's the main piece of it. So tonight is about sort of the design phase of the game, which is largely revolving around these flow charts. But before we even get to the flow chart, there are a couple of things also to think about when it comes to games. And I'm going to open this up a little bit here so we can use this as a place to take notes. So hopefully you've been able to, and actually you guys are all one group, right? So we've got one group here, which is kind of advantageous, I guess. Is that, hopefully you guys have started having the discussion about what the topic of your game is going to be and kind of those initial analysis questions. What problem are you trying to solve? What, sort of direction are you looking to go in? So the next piece of that in terms of design focuses a lot around, can I zoom in? There's a key you can push on a Mac that, I guess it's none of those keys.
You could do those 3 little dots in the upper corner of Zoom. See it there?
Oh yeah,
No,
I'm not a,
Yeah.
there we go. I'm not typically a Chrome person, so I don't, oh, and then that all
At
just,
the bottom.
there we go. This is what I want. So over the next week, so the big thing for next week is going to be to really start working on the ID plan for the game, and mainly the A and the D, the analysis and the design phase. So this is really all about that design. The analysis, I think, especially because we've been doing it in the Moodle and everything else, those questions I think are going to be pretty familiar. Who's your audience? What's the problem you're trying to solve, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of so in terms of design, these are going to be mainly the types of things that you're going to want to address. So number one, game delivery mode, which is essentially what kind of a game is it? Is it a board game? Is it a card game? Is it a role-playing game? Is it a video game? Is it a dice game? So that basically just encompasses what category of games does this belong in. So the game that we're going to use as our focus tonight is Uno, which you guys all play Uno, yes?
A long time ago.
Okay.
I don't
But
remember it. Yes. Honestly.
So
I don't
You'll
remember
remember.
that.
if we were looking at Uno, what is obviously the game
Card
delivery mode for Uno? It's a card game.
I did know that.
So that's one thing that obviously you're going to need to decide about your game. Last year, the 3 game projects that came in, one was a board game. It involved cards, but that wasn't the actual sort of playing thing, was moving pieces around a board. One of them was a card game, and then one of them, a little tricky to figure out. I would actually call it, I guess, essentially a board game, but you guys know Hollywood Squares?
Mhm.
What that game was, where people would have to answer. So what they actually did was they would have 9 students actually sitting in that sort of Hollywood Squares grid, and the contestants would be picking somebody to ask a question of, and then if that person, whatever that person answered, the person asking had to decide if they got the question right or wrong, and then they would get X's and O's and sort of a thing. So I guess
So
that's
it's okay to take
that's
inspiration from other games.
sure, yeah. I don't want to say every game has been invented at this point, but certainly you're going to look at almost any game and say, oh, that's a lot like, that's a lot like, so there are definitely kind of archetypes of games, and a lot of times games will build off of those. So obviously Uno is a card game, but you're going to want to think about essentially what are the things that your students are going to be interacting with the game through. How are they going to keep track of the game? Is it, moving pieces around a board? Is it exchanging cards, collecting cards, getting rid of cards? That sort of a thing. Dice game, probably not so much in schools. Some schools are still touchy about dice. Our school still officially has a rule that kids aren't allowed to play any card games, like even in study halls, which I guess it goes back to some connection to gambling or something like that. I don't know. It seems like, I don't think anybody enforces it anymore, but I know maybe 10 years ago, if you were in study halls, they made sure to let you know if you got a study hall, kids should not be playing card games. Like, I'd rather them sitting there playing a card game with each other than running around, being on their phones. Yeah. So then obviously another design decision you have to make is about your competitive agents. And we've talked about how it could be one player versus one player. It could be a group of players versus another group of players, team. Is it a player or players versus the rules, as in solitaire or any number of games like that? And this is obviously maybe one of the first places where that question that we talked about last time about competition, about sort of how much direct head-to-head competition do you want your game to involve? Is that going to get in the way of the instructional purpose of the game? So if it's one person versus one person, that's obviously a different dynamic than a group versus a group. But if you have a group, how do you guarantee that everybody in the group is actually all those things we talk about in just instruction. If it's players versus game, you kind of take that piece away. There's it's the game that wins or loses. So that's going to be something to think about. So in Uno, it's what?
It could be player versus player.
Yeah, I mean, basically, there are a couple of different modes you can do Uno, but Uno is almost always single players competing against each other. So for that particular game. All right, so then these next two, these are probably the most. There's a whole rabbit hole of game design theory that you can go down, and I think it's useful only to a point. So these two next things are really as deep into real gaming theory as I think we need to get, and that's informational and developmental style of the game. So informational style has to do with if you pick any moment during a game, how much information does a given player have about the complete state of the game at that moment? So the two are perfect and imperfect. So a common example for perfect is chess, or I guess checkers, because at any given moment, both players know where every single piece is. They know how many pieces are on the board. They know how many pieces have been taken off the board. They know how each piece can move. So at any given moment, each player knows everything about the state of the game. And there are a lot of games along those lines where everything's just out there and you are making decisions a lot of times based off of what you think the other person's going to do, because it's not a question of whether something's there or not. You know whether it's there or not. So so that is one type of game, letting everybody know what everything is, and there's really nothing that is unknown other than just what decisions the people are going to be making from turn to turn. Imperfect obviously then just means that is not the case. So there are unknowns. From one player's perspective, there are always unknowns.
So like card games.
Card games, perfect example, because unless you're playing with an open hand, you only know the state of your cards and maybe the state of ones that have been discarded. Obviously, like Las Vegas doesn't want you counting cards, but that's the only information you have. So anything beyond that is guesswork on your part. So you're always working from an imperfect amount of information. And what this kind of really impacts directly are those meaningful ambiguous decisions. If the game itself has ambiguity, that can really help the decisions that the players are make also be ambiguous. If they don't know what the right answer is because they don't know where every card is or where every piece is at any given point, then that can help make those get past that, oh, there's just one right answer and I just have to figure out what the right answer is. But obviously chess is one of the best known games, and it is a perfect game in terms of informational style. Doesn't take away from the playing of the game. People spend their entire lives becoming grandmasters at chess. It just changes where those ambiguous decisions kind of come from.
Would a game be considered imperfect if you don't know like the question that's going to be asked? Like maybe you know all the pieces, you know where everybody is,
you know the top.
But if there are unknowns,
so even just I know I'm going to pull a question that I might have to answer, but not knowing what the question is.
Right, and that may impact strategy depending on the game. Like maybe you have a choice of whether to turn over a new card or take the card that's there. And you know you're going to have a card in the end, but you don't know what that card is. So then when you're making your decision, you're basing it off of, I hope I get a question that I know, or do I go with the question that I know is there, but maybe I don't know as well, or, you know, so yeah, it's really, you really just think of it like pick a player in your game and ask, does this player know the complete status of the game at any given point? If they do, it's a perfect game. If they don't, it's imperfect. And I know those two words are a little tricky because perfect sounds better than imperfect. It's not. Either one of them is completely useful. It just results in a different type of game in terms of how the decisions are made and what kind of decisions are being made. So that's just going to be something to think about. So to return to Uno, what would Uno be? It's going to be imperfect because all you know really is the cards in your hand, unless your young daughter has not yet learned how to hold her cards up and is like holding them out here, and you can't help but see what she's holding in her hand. Not that that ever happened. That was one of the hardest things.
But you still don't know what's in the
You don't know what's in the pile. You don't know, but you know, do you let your young kids win games?
Mm-mm.
Or do you just teach them right from the beginning that you've got to get good enough
Maybe
at the
once or
game?
twice, but,
Yeah.
I think it depends on the
yeah.
My daughter was
Really?
actually really good at Uno from a pretty young age. Like she would,
Yeah.
without me trying to throw the game or purposefully do anything, like she would pull out some pretty convincing wins.
I keep it close. Like you'd be like, I would probably still win, but like, yeah, I wouldn't get it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's like in which was the Pixar movie, the Incredibles,
Yeah.
where Dash is saying, you know, well, win, go ahead and win, but not by too much, you know, because he could obviously outrun every kid on the track, but they're like, just a little bit, just win by a little bit. Okay, yeah, okay. So, all right. So then the other one here, sort of game theory wise, is the developmental style. This isn't about how you develop the game, but during the game play, how does the game develop? And the two main things here are progressive versus repetitive. So a progressive game means that in each round of the game, things change. So as the game goes along, either the rules change or the goals change or the types of choices that can be made change, as opposed to repetitive, where basically the same set of rules just keeps getting cycled over and over and over and over and over again. So, you know, again, to go back to chess is basically repetitive. I mean, the same rules apply on every turn. There are some things that change a little bit in the game, but those are true from the beginning of the game. If you get a pawn to the other end of the board, that turns into a queen, and now you've got two queens you can play with, and some things like that. But for the most part, you know, it really stays the same all the way through. Whereas some of the more involved, like role-playing types of games and so on, if you're moving through a scenario of some kind, then the game is more progressive. That one given round of the game may be working under a very different set of guidelines than an earlier round of the game or than a later round of the game. Obviously, repetitive games are a lot easier to manage because you basically can come up with one set of rules, one round of turns, and then the players just keep repeating that until they reach the end game. But sometimes that can be a little boring too. And maybe the subject you're trying to address would lend itself more towards some sort of a progressive. I would make the case that, for example, like the game of life is a progressive game. Even though the turns go back and forth, depending on where you are on the board, you know, the first section of the board, you haven't gotten your college degree yet or whatever it is, your job, so you don't know what your pay is going to be. And then there's sort of the main part of the board, but then there's the end game of the board where there's a whole different set of things you're trying to achieve. So that, you know, I would say Monopoly is probably also somewhat of a progressive game because as hotels get added and houses get added and people get monopolies and the strategy really kind of shifts. There's sort of that moment in the middle of Monopoly where all the monopolies have been gotten, and then the game becomes a totally different game of just like cutthroat. How many hotels can I get on there as fast as possible? So that's just gonna be another thing for you to consider with your game. Is do you see the game as just being, here's the way one round works, and now just keep going until somebody wins, or is it going to be something that has more of almost like a storyline that progresses as the game goes through? So Uno would be a repetitive. It really just stays the same all the way through. Little things change about the game in terms of what direction the cards are going in or the players are going in or stuff, but it's still really the same set of rules. So now we've got the meaningful ambiguous, and this is definitely a discussion you're going to want to have to make sure that this is in your game somehow. And this is maybe the place that in some ways is toughest educationally, because a lot of times with education there's the right answer. And if there's only one right answer that a student has to get to, that's not really meaningful ambiguous questions or problems that they have to address. And you're really presenting them more with a puzzle that needs to be solved as opposed to an actual game. So you want to really think about, at a given moment, does the player have choice? Is there just a right choice that they need to make and a wrong choice? Or can they make either choice and still have the game progress, but in a way that they don't necessarily know how it's going to progress? Like picking path A doesn't necessarily lead to a win, depending on how it goes. So definitely, I mean, the yes/no question is yes, we definitely should have meaningful ambiguous decisions being made. If the answer is yes, then you've got to figure out what is the meaningful ambiguous decision that's being made and make sure that that's really baked into the game from the beginning. So in the case of Uno, what's the meaningful, I guess I should say first, are there meaningfully ambiguous decisions being made? Yeah. And basically, what does that boil down to?
Which card you play. Do you keep it the same color or do you change colors?
Right.
Do you hold your draw fours or play your draw fours?
Or wait until you can be really mean to somebody. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. Draw four. You thought you were winning. So yeah, absolutely. And that's a pretty easy one on Uno because that is really your only decision that you're making, but you never know. And you've probably played Uno or remember Uno enough that you get down to that last card and you're like, oh, it's in the bag. And 2 turns later, you're back to 12 cards in your hand. And you're like, oh, great. Now the game's going to go on for another half hour. Can we just decide to finish? There are actually 2 acceptable rules in Uno that affect the length of the game. That has to do with whether you keep drawing cards until you can play one, or do you just draw one, and if you can't play it, your turn is done and it moves on to the next player. So if you get bored playing Uno, play with the second rule because then you end up with fewer cards in your hands. The game usually ends faster. So that's in terms of Uno, but in your own games, that's going to be something you're going to want to address. And then just to round out, if you notice, I've kind of baked in our definition here. So we've got the competitive agents. The rules are kind of baked into the meaningful ambiguous part of it and what style of game it is. You've got the competitive agents, the ambiguous, and now we've got the end game. And again, the argument would be if there isn't really a defined end game or a set of things that brings about the end of the game, it's not really a game. Then it just becomes a simulation or an activity or something along those lines. So again, in your own projects, you're going to want to think about what constitutes the end of the game. And hopefully it's not just, oh, we ran out of time, so let's just finish there. That there should be something that in music, the equivalent of that is, I call it the dreaded repeat and fade. When bands don't really know how to end a song, and so they just tell the engineer, we're just going to keep playing and you just fade it out. I hate that because to me that means the band was lazy and didn't want to actually sit down and figure out how to actually finish their song. So anyways, so in Uno, is there a end game? Yeah. Of course. And what is the end game?
No cards left.
Yeah. Out of cards. Yay! Now we can go and do something else. So this week, the main homework for this week is the ID plan, is the first 2 phases. And this basically covers the questions you're going to need to think about for your own game. So there's really, aside from yes, there should be meaningful, ambiguous decisions, and yes, there should be an end game, the rest of it, there's no right or wrong answer to this. You can decide to make whatever kind of game you want, whatever you think is going to be best in terms of the agents, whatever styles you want to use. And as long as the decisions are meaningful and ambiguous, then obviously that's going to depend on your specific game and however you feel like the game should end. So that's going to be the main thing for this coming week. So are there, I mean, that seems pretty straightforward to me, but so using a game like Uno, I think is helpful.
I think it
Thought
does
about all
too.
those things, yeah.
Okay, good. So, so then the next piece in terms of developing the game and designing the game is this whole issue of flow charting. And I'm not saying that every game has to have a flow chart as part of its procedure, but I would bet if you talk to most game designers, flow charting is definitely a big piece of what they do, because it is, I think, the best way to visualize how the game actually goes. And when you're trying to develop the rules, it is the way for you to either figure out that you've got rules you don't need, and I've seen that happen a lot. People make the game more complicated than it needs to be, or more importantly almost is to catch those moments where potentially people could exit out of your game structure, and then what happens now? If you know the movie Tron.
Really?
Tron. There have been 2 versions of it. It came out
Oh, I
when I
definitely
was,
watched that. I definitely
yeah, it
watched
was,
that.
but basically,
Jack of all trades, master of none.
basically people get sucked into a video game is the premise of the thing, and the person who gets sucked in figures out how to basically break out of the game structure he's in and start kind of just spelunking around in the game world. So anyway, so it's that idea, like you don't want to, I mean, in a video game that would be a crash when somebody clicks on the thing that you didn't think anyone would ever think to click on, and that causes the game to go, I don't know what to do now. What should I do? And it kind of freezes or crashes or something. So this is the physical world analog to that, is to make sure that the game doesn't crash, that you don't have someone come up and say, but he ended up with this, and it doesn't say in the rules what we're supposed to do now, and so on. So here's what we're gonna do. I should say what you guys are gonna do is, yes, we're going totally analog with this one with the big piece of paper, which I don't know, we could throw that up on a table, or if you want to leave it on the floor or something. I've got tape too, we could tape it to a wall, maybe that board back there or something. But the idea is this: we have this game Uno, and just in case it's been a while, or you're curious, because sometimes people play what they think are the rules of Uno, and then they discover that they've been playing it wrong for years and years and years. So I actually did include on our Moodle the official version of rules from Mattel for Uno. So this is the official rules of it. So it covers the object of the game, the setup, and then it explains the special cards, and then the play. And mainly what I'm interested in tonight is the actual play. You can put a box on the flow chart for setup, but you don't have to spell out like each individual part of the setup. That can be just one thing. Everybody gets this number of cards, the rest are put here, whatever. We're really interested in once the game actually begins. So the idea is going to be to take the rules, which, interestingly enough, the actual gameplay rules boil down to basically just that much. So let's play. So this is where the game starts, and it talks about what happens in a given turn, and then when that turn is done, and then even when the player is done. So this even covers sort of the end game of it. and a little bit about going out, that dreaded remembering to say Uno when you put your last card down. And then there is actually scoring. If you didn't know that, there's actually a point system for Uno if you play the whole thing. So, and then there's a couple of other things. They get into two-player partners, multi-table tournaments. I mean, it gets kind of, so we're not going to worry about that. Reneging, that is actually a part of the rules, because that is a little known rule that people actually don't know about. You can decide, even if you can play a card, to not play a card and draw one instead. A lot of people think you're not allowed to do that. That if you have a card you can play, you have to play it. So anyways, so the idea is going to be to take what's really just a few paragraphs here and figure out what that actually looks like in a flowchart format. So in terms of flowcharting and in terms of the games, basically we're going to have rectangles and diamonds, and that's why I have post-its, because you can turn a post-it diagonally and get a diamond. So I've got post-its and I've got markers, so you can also color code if you feel like it. But the idea is to start at the beginning, use rectangles for actions. So something happens, and that could be a rule. It doesn't mean a player necessarily is doing something, but something that happens as a result of a player. And then anywhere that a meaningful decision has to be made, that would be a diamond, because that would be a case where there might be multiple outcomes depending on their decision. So it's going to be kind of going through. And just to prepare you, what you will probably do is start by thinking, oh, this is pretty straightforward. Everyone knows how to play Uno. But the minute you start going in and thinking about what actually happens at each moment of a round, it does get more complicated. So another reason for using the post-its is so that you can move things around and adjust things and so on. So rectangles and diamonds connected. And the key here is that there should be no dead ends other than the end game. So there will be somewhere at the bottom of the flow chart, we made it to the end. The end, player wins. Everything else at any other point, there should always be an exit out of the box or out of the diamond that leads somewhere else. So anywhere that there, I mean, actions should usually just lead to another action, but anywhere there's a decision, you need to think about all of the possible outcomes of that decision and make sure that they're all accounted for in terms of what happens next. And then at some point, you'll probably have maybe not a player decision, but a game decision. Is the game done? Or does player not have any cards left? And that would then lead to the end game or lead back into wherever it needs to lead back into another round. All right. So in the past, there's been some angst over this, and some people get more involved than they maybe need to. So that's not the intent of this. But because this is an activity that essentially you're going to need to do for your own game, I figured we'd start by taking a game that kind of everyone's familiar with, more or less, and just see what that looks like as we start to pull it apart, so that you can see kind of what a game flow chart ends up looking like. So yeah, it would be like, I would say, start.
I'm reading the rules.
Yeah, so you would start with it. Usually, one way to do it is to kind of start with the obvious blocks. So, you'll have something for this game setup, but after the game setup is done, first block would be player picks a card in their hand to play. And then something happens based on that, and then their turn is done, and it cycles back to the next person. But then obviously between those big kind of moments, you then start saying, okay, well, they decide to play this card. What happens if they play that card? What happens if they play this card?
You don't
So
know
then,
until you know what the other people have in their hand, right?
I was gonna say,
Well,
how do we know what cards they have?
Yeah, exactly. They
so you have
other
to,
people
so you
around
just
them.
have to, but also, take the instructions, because in theory, these rules have been written well and account for every situation. So if you look at the rules and kind of see what they say, you're kind of taking those rules and putting them into graphic form. So if it says, player chooses card to play. If they play a thus and
Red
thus,
card.
then here's what happens next. Or if they play a wild draw 4, then they have to do this and this and this.
So would the colors all be the same if they pick a colored card, or is it if they pick a green card? I haven't played in a long time, so I'm not.
It has to match color or number or
Unless
thing
you're
on the
first.
face, unless you're first. The first person. Well, no, because usually
you have to
they
determine.
there's a card already there that has to get matched
Okay,
to.
so you either match the
Yeah.
color or
They
you
thought we were
match-
all gonna know how to play Uno.
Well,
Just
and
like,
if,
I don't
if you want to take a
remember.
moment to just read
I do have to
I
read
definitely
that.
do.
read
That's
through
right,
the
yeah.
your instructions.
I don't remember.
Yeah, I mean, this is really sort of the activity for tonight. So
Okay.
just if you want to take a few minutes and just refresh in your mind what the actual rules are.
Yeah, I don't
And
ever
then-
remember playing this where the cards had like points in the end, whoever. Just
Well,
picked that
almost
card.
nobody does that.
Oh,
That's like
okay.
tournament play.
Oh,
If you're going to have multiple games where you're keeping track, not just of, oh, they won 2 times and they won 4 times, but there is actually a technical point system where you come out of the
Okay.
game and people kind of earn different amounts of points. And if you're playing in a tournament, then it becomes.
Could you put the rules up there so we can refer back to them on the big screen?
Yeah.
I'm trying to.
Yeah, let me see what I can do to make as much of it visible as possible here. Obviously not that. The main part,
I think we should play the game.
I almost thought about like, I wonder if I should just throw in a,
It'll make it clearer if we played the game.
so yeah, I'll go down to the let's play and going out part, but there is, I mean, they have a description of each of the special cards in terms of
Yeah.
what happens with each of them. But this is the basic gameplay
Let's play.
round and going out of the game. So see what you can do with it. That's exploring.